Welcome to week 3 of Financial Resource Development. The final product for this class is to design and develop a 3-year comprehensive fundraising plan. You can either do this for a nonprofit or for a program within a nonprofit. In this week's video lecture, what we're going to talk about is SWOT analysis, the fundraising ladder of effectiveness, and also I'm going to share with you some very important information moving forward so that this can be successful for you. So let's start with the SWOT. The SWOT analysis, if you're not sure how to do one, you can look it up. It's a very, very common business practice where you list strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for your organization. But I think it's very important that I point out you need to be realistic. This week we have a case study where you're going to do a SWOT analysis, but also for your final fundraising plan you'll do a SWOT analysis. And one of the things that I see happen a lot is people start envisioning these grandiose plans, not realizing you really only have one person who you're already overworking. And so I would ask that you be very realistic. One thing to consider when evaluating programs and suggesting changes, especially like in your SWOT analysis or your fundraising plan, is the role that ready-made business models and their fit in nonprofit organizations have. So let me give you an example. Strategic planning. While strategic plans do have their place in nonprofit organizations, they're not the magic bullet that a lot of people pretend they are. So in a study of 92 food pantries and soup kitchens in the Detroit region, a researcher found that many capacity attributes involving technical assistance, strategic planning, had little or no correlation with organizational effectiveness. So basically what they did was they went into these soup kitchens and such, they did all these strategic plans, they spent hours and hours and hours of staff time, and then they yielded absolutely no results at all. However, he did find, however, that effectiveness was improved through better staffing, especially when hiring professional paid staff rather than relying on volunteers. Brought them in the range where these strategic plans actually meant something. And so if you step back and think about this, what was probably happening? Well, you probably had an organization where the staff was already overworked, like many of our nonprofits. You got a bunch of board members who sat together and decided these other things that staff who were already overworked could do, and the staff just didn't have time to do that. They were doing well, making it through their day-to-day. And so we need to recognize what is going to be required of individuals for us to put these plans into place. Another researcher, also looking at the same thing, whether or not capacity building and strategic planning actually had any impact on nonprofits, she interviewed 50 leading consultants and grant makers in capacity building in a certain region in the United States, and she documented a lot of problems, but there were 4 main ones that stuck out. Number 1, few changes recommended by consultants were actually implemented by nonprofits. And so if you think about it, a lot of times nonprofits will get a consultant to come in and help them with their strategic planning, but none of this is actually implemented. Another issue was strategic planning often particularly disappointed in giving the time and the effort that it took to collect the data, analyze the trends, but few results were changed. So basically this again points to the fact that that a few people decided this was really important, and so they spent a lot of time, an hour gathering all this data, but again, no results. And so it was basically just a waste of time. And consultants are often rebuffed when attempting to assist with implementation, either because clients only want assistance with planning or because funders support planning but not implementation. So if you work for a nonprofit that does grants and such, you might want to consider this, because study after study shows that strategic planning in itself isn't actually helpful, right? We need to be able to implement this, but if we don't have the funds, which can also equate to staff personnel, if we don't have the capital to implement any of these changes, then we're really just wasting our time. And so this research challenges the assumption that technical and management training is needed. And again, we get back to the ideal that it's not necessarily about whether or not we have the skills, it's whether or not we have the time to implement these things. So when you're doing your SWOT analysis, you need to be very realistic about what it would take to implement the things that you're talking about. Now then, a very important term in fundraising is the ladder of effectiveness. If you do a quick Google search and look at images, you'll see all kinds of neat graphics and stuff that you can use in a presentation to present this ideal to your board. However, this right here is a basic ladder of effectiveness, and this shows us things that are most effective versus those things that are least effective. What gives us the biggest return on our effort and return on our investment as far as time. So you'll see fundraising ladder of effectiveness, a personal face-to-face ask is actually the most effective way to get a donation. The next most effective is a personal letter on personal stationery, not the organization stationery, but this would be like your board challenge letters, right? With a telephone follow up. And then the next effectiveness would be without a telephone follow up. Personal telephone calls with a letter then that follows, and the personalized letters that go over the internet. So this would be an email from your personal account or from like the executive director or what have you. Next, we have telephone solicitation, impersonal letters, so your direct mail and stuff, impersonal phone calls, fundraising, benefits, and special events, door-to-door, media, and internet advertising. So one of the things that I want you to look at when you're looking at your organization and what you're recommending and even what your organization does is where do your events rank in the fundraising ladder of effectiveness? Because what we find a lot of times, especially dealing with smaller nonprofits, is you'll say things like, oh, we need to get money and we need to be more successful in our fundraising. And so the very first thing is, hey, let's have a garage sale, or hey, let's have a bake sale, or hey, let's put on another special event. And studies have actually shown that special events actually cost organizations more money than they bring in. So imagine this scenario for a minute. Let's say that you decide to do a dance. And part of paying for the ticket of the dance is you're having to pay for the musicians who are playing at the dance, you're having to pay for the food, and you figure out that it's costing you $20 per person. And so you're going to charge $50 per person so that you have a little bit of room to make a profit, right? And so you do that. However, in the donor's mind, they just donated $50, not recognizing that the other percentage actually costs money, because in their mind, you got everything donated. And studies have actually shown that after that, if you send like a direct mail or something impersonal, they are less likely to donate because they feel like they already gave you $50 and they went to your event, which helped you out. And so one of the things that I find is that people actually spend the most amount of time doing the things that are least effective. Now, some of these you can think about and you can say, okay, so like a direct mail piece, maybe, yes, it's not quite as effective. It's kind of on the lower middle end, but it doesn't take me that long to do it and mail it out to 10,000 people. Other things like fundraising in special event capacity takes hours and hours and hours, and your staff is all dedicated to that. So you really need to ask, is it worth it? And notice that fundraising special events is actually just above door-to-door solicitations. So a lot of times whenever I mention this, students will always point out the outliers and say, oh, well, I know such and such organization that does a special event and they get $300,000 a year. Yes, but the reason you're talking about them is because they are the outlier. They are not the trend. That's not what happens to the majority of organizations. And we need to recognize how long it took for them to get in that role and how much planning and stuff went into making that event as successful as it was. So here's what the research actually shows on whether or not these things are effective and what percentage rate. So remember down here I said personal visitation by individual donor or team. That actually has been shown to yield a 50% success rate. So for every 2 people you and your team go and talk with personally and ask for a personal donation, you'll get a donation 1 out of every 2 times. Personal letter with phone calls, successful 40% of the time. Personal phone calls with a letter, successful 25% of the time. But then we come down here and we'll say door-to-door canvassing when done by someone dressed in a uniform, so not just your volunteer, but someone actually dressed in a uniform that conveys authority, has been shown to be successful 10 to 15% of the time, direct mail 2% of the time, and successful special events. There was a very interesting study that looked at the net return on investment, and it actually found that in the cases that they looked at, it was successful 0% of the time. And what they found was, what they basically did was they took how much time volunteers had dedicated to that organization and staff and calculated how much it would have been if they would have just gone to work and donated the money for those hours that they did, and they would have actually come out better in that impact. And they actually found that the volunteers became quite discouraged when they were presented with that information. And so in one particular study, it actually was effective 0% of the time. So when you're doing this, I want you to pay attention to where you're spending the majority of your time. If you're spending the majority of your time planning these least successful events, you might need to reconsider your fundraising approach. Let the data support you. Now, another thing that's very important for you going forward is when we start looking at our final fundraising plan. I want you to put time requirements when you say something. Now, I am asking this in order to protect yourself. It is very common for our students here in the M&M program to work for nonprofits, and especially sometimes nonprofits will pay for them to take this particular class. The students come in with this awesome fundraising plan, give it to the board of directors, and the board of directors says, this is great, you now do this, implement this plan, without considering our people are already overworked. So, for example, whenever we come to our final fundraising plan, when you're writing it, you're going to create a calendar, and you're going to say January 1st, start writing the direct mail letter. And you're going to say that's going to take 5 hours. Because at the end, the board needs to be able to add all this up and realize that this can be a full-time job, depending upon what all you're recommending, and that is unrealistic to put all that responsibility on one person. So that's just a key note going forward. I hope you found this video helpful. As always, please reach out if you have any questions.